Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, welcome and thank you all for attending tonight's webinar on biosimilars. My name is Catherine Soto, National Education Manager at CCFA. This program is supported through a sponsorship from AbbVie Inc. and an educational grant from Amgen. Additional support is provided through CCFA's annual giving programs and donors. If you have any technical difficulties during the program, please dial audience support at the number you see on the left side of your screen. If you prefer to listen to the program via telephone, you can also find the participant dial-in number on the left side of your screen. After the presentation, we will open up the program for your questions. We will take as many questions as time allows from webcast participants. If we are not able to take your questions, our IBD Help Center can be reached Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time by calling 888-694-8872. Upon exiting tonight's program, you will be prompted to complete a brief program survey. We ask that you please complete the survey and take a few minutes to provide your responses, as your feedback is extremely important to us as we plan for future educational activities. I now have the pleasure of introducing our speakers for tonight's program. Dr. Noah Krugliak-Cleveland is a resident physician at the University of Chicago Medicine, specializing in inflammatory bowel diseases. She has been lead and co-author of various publications covering topics such as treatment strategy assessments in IBD, safety and efficacy of certain vaccinations in Crohn's disease, and many other areas of research. Dr. Cleveland is also a member of CCFA's Government and Industry Affairs Committee. We also welcome Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin is a professor of medicine and chief of the section for gastroenterology, hepatology, and nutrition at the University of Chicago Medicine. He is twice the recipient of the ACG's Governor's Affairs Excellence in Clinical Research and the Cancer Research Foundation's Young Investigators Award. In 2012, he received the CCFA's Rosenthal Award, a national leadership award bestowed upon a volunteer who has contributed in an indisputable way to the quality of life of patients and families. He is the current chair of CCFA's Government and Industry Affairs Committee. It is now my great pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Rubin.
Well, thanks, Kat, and I want to welcome everybody joining us now and those who will be listening in the future when this is archived. This is a very important topic, and you obviously knew that by choosing to be with us and to learn about this tonight. But biosimilars are arriving in the United States. They've been around for a while in Asia and Europe, so we can learn from our colleagues there. But the Government and Industry Affairs Committee of the CCFA has been working to understand biosimilars, to develop a position statement that we will share with you this evening, and to develop educational programs both for patients as well as for professionals. Tonight's program has been put together by our committee as well as the staff at the CCFA, and I want to especially thank Kat and Laura Wingate for helping us put this program together. Can we advance to the next slide? Thank you. So let's review where we are in managing inflammatory bowel disease so that it's clear what the needs are of patients who suffer from these conditions. The first thing, which we always talk about, is the need to cure Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. We haven't forgotten about that, and in fact, that's part of the mission of the CCFA. While there's still a lot of work to be done to achieve that goal, in the meantime, we certainly have a variety of other goals that we can be focused upon. One is the prevention of IBD altogether in at-risk individuals, or the prevention of recurrence of IBD after people have had surgery. We certainly need more research into understanding the causes of these diseases and how to improve the quality of life of other people. And we need better therapies. We need therapies that will work for people who don't respond to their initial treatments, and we need therapies for people who lose response after initial therapies work for them. In addition to all of this, we're coming to appreciate more and more the burden inflammatory bowel disease has on people, not just in terms of how the disease affects them directly, but in all the indirect effects, including their ability to get the therapies that they need and to afford them, as well as for society to afford them. So when we think about talking about biosimilars, we have to think about it in the context of all these other needs. The medical treatment options for inflammatory bowel disease have been focused on observations made about what people who have these conditions have in their intestines. They can be broken into a variety of different classes, and I'm sure that all the patients who've logged in this evening are familiar with some of these. That includes antibiotics, aminosalicylate therapies, which are the 5-ASA drugs, steroids, which I know are well known to many of you, and then immune-based therapies, which include immunomodulators and biological therapies. Now, the immune-based therapies are based on the understanding that whatever is the cause of IBD is triggering an uncontrolled immune response. The immunomodulators include azathioprine and 6-mercaptopurine and another drug which is called methotrexate. And the biological therapies currently include two broad classes of therapies. And when we started using biological therapies, we entered a new era in IBD. The two classes of biological therapies currently available for inflammatory bowel disease in the United States include the anti-TNF therapies, which are antibodies or antibody fragments that target a protein called TNF, an inflammatory protein. And the second class, anti-integrins. Anti-integrins work by a different mechanism. They actually prevent the migration of white blood cells out of the blood vessels into the bowel. So by shutting off that mechanism, you can turn down the cellular mechanism. There are currently 3 anti-TNF therapies approved for Crohn's disease in the U.S. Infliximab, also known as Remicade, adalimumab, also known as Humira, and certolizumab pegol, also known as Cimzia, and 3 anti-TNF therapies approved for the treatment of ulcerative colitis. That would include infliximab, adalimumab, and the third one is golimumab, also known as Simponi. The anti-integrin therapies, there's actually 2 available in the U.S., natalizumab, which treats both Crohn's disease, and because it also affects the central nervous system, can treat a condition called multiple sclerosis, and vedolizumab, also known as Entyvio, which treats Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis and is more specific in its action and does not affect the central nervous system, so it doesn't treat multiple sclerosis.
Let's talk about biologics. So biologics are large complex proteins. They, when used in inflammatory bowel disease, target the immune system. Unlike simple medicine, biologics are very large and therefore cannot have identical copies made of them. So in conventional medicine, you can have identical copies. They're often referred to as generics. But with biologics, given their complexity, only similar copies can be made, and they're often referred to as biosimilar products, which is what we're going to focus on today. So why can't we have identical copies of biologics? So biologics are proteins, as I mentioned and illustrated in this figure. You can see that, and those of you who have background in biology may find this familiar. Biologics are made of simple amino acids. That's their primary structure. They're folded on themselves to create a large protein that is made of multiple chains of amino acids. They're made in a multi-step process, and also important to remember that are made in living cells. Therefore, like most biologic processes made in living cells, it is quite impossible to create identical proteins. So what are biosimilars? CCFA created a Twitter poll and asked the voters what they know about biosimilars. The first question was, how familiar are you with biosimilars? And out of 100 voters, 51% said that they've never heard of them. Another scenario was presented where a biosimilar of an anti-TNF is proven effective in rheumatoid arthritis and now FDA approved for inflammatory bowel disease. The voters were asked whether they would take it, and 47% said that they're not sure, they don't know. However, 44% said yes. The last scenario that was presented was one in which insurance company proposes to switch you from a current medication to a biosimilar and asked the voters whose decision should this be, whether it should be the physician's decision, the patient, or the insurance company. 52% of the voters thought it should be the patient's decision, and 46% thought it should be the physician's. Only 1% thought it should be the insurance company's decision.
Biosimilars are similar copies of what we would call an originator biologic. Sometimes the originator is also called a reference product or innovator. In order to gain the designation of biosimilar, it has to demonstrate the same strength, route of administration, that means whether it's IV or injection, effectiveness, and safety. But as you've already heard from Dr. Cleveland, they're not an identical copy because that's very difficult in biological processes. But in order to be called a biosimilar, they have to behave the same way. The regulatory pathway for getting originator biologics approved in the United States and biosimilars approved is quite rigorous and is run by the FDA. Originator biologics, the pathway is seen on the left on this slide, and it includes registration with the FDA, who then explains to the company how they need to perform the studies that will gain them approval, clinical trials in the specific disease states in which they are most interested, followed by returning to the FDA with the results of the effectiveness and safety, and then the drug can be approved and get labeling. It has to occur like this for every indication that the drug will be used to treat. In distinction, biosimilars do have a regulatory pathway, but they are enabled to study just one disease state or maybe a second disease state, and if they demonstrate biosimilarity, they can gain approval in all the diseases that the originator drug already has approval for. So this enables a biosimilar to have less clinical trials, but then to gain approval and be used in all the different indications. This is very important because it introduces the concept of extrapolation to our audience tonight. Biosimilars can be extrapolated to other indications. That's what I was explaining. So the idea here is that if you study the drug in one indication and it demonstrates the same benefit as the originator, it then can be used, as long as the FDA agrees, in all the other indications. That's called extrapolation. An example would be a biosimilar infliximab that works equally well in rheumatoid arthritis, which can then be extrapolated to receive FDA approval without any additional studies for Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, ankylosing spondylitis, which is inflammation of the joints, psoriasis, which is inflammation of the skin, and psoriatic arthritis, which is another type of inflammation of the joints. This is an extremely important concept to understand. The other concept that you should learn tonight is called interchangeability. In the United States, the FDA has a separate designation that is called interchangeable biosimilars. A biosimilar that is extrapolated to other indications doesn't necessarily gain interchangeability. Interchangeability means that a patient who's stable on an originator can be switched to a biosimilar and they don't have a loss of effectiveness or a change in the safety profile. In order to gain an interchangeable status, a biosimilar has to be studied in what's called a switch study, where patients are on the biosimilar or on the originator, and they're switched between the two, and they demonstrate no loss of efficacy and no change in safety. So it's important to remember that just because there's extrapolation, meaning the drug can be prescribed for different diseases, does not guarantee that it can be switched unless it has the interchangeable status. Now, another piece of information for you all to learn has to do with who actually regulates this. Although the FDA will grant extrapolation and interchangeable status, how it's actually prescribed and whether or not there needs to be specific communication about how it's prescribed is a state-by-state issue in the United States. The map you're looking at now shows you what current laws about biosimilars are either in existence in different states or are under some progression otherwise. You can look at your state here and then go to the website that's on this slide to learn more about this.
You may want to know when these will be available, so let's talk about what's in the pipeline. Earlier this year, the FDA approved the first biosimilar for IBD. It is called Inflectra. It is a biosimilar of infliximab, or Remicade, and it has been studied in ankylosing spondylitis and rheumatoid arthritis and been extrapolated to Crohn's disease in adults and children and ulcerative colitis in adults. It is important to emphasize that it is not interchangeable with infliximab. So just to reiterate the points that Dr. Rubin just taught you, when you say it's not interchangeable, it means that Inflectra cannot be switched to infliximab. If a patient is being, or vice versa, so if a patient is being treated with infliximab, it cannot be switched to Inflectra. It has not been studied nor approved for that. It is not yet available. It's projected to be available in the market around 2018. There are about 650 biosimilars in development, and about 50% of them are still in very early clinical trial stages. It takes a very long time to develop these biosimilars, and it's a very costly process, as you can see here. There are about 13 biosimilars currently developed for adalimumab and 9 for infliximab. As many of these biologics are being developed and soon will be introduced to the market, there are many potential issues that may arise, and I want to discuss a few of them. The first is the risk when you have a patient who is currently stable on an originator or a biologic and then switch to a biosimilar. There's always a concern for a loss of response or efficacy when a patient is on an originator and then switch to a biosimilar. Additionally, there's a concern for immunogenicity or cross-reactivity. What that means is that when a patient is on an originator, or a biologic treatment in other words, and loses response to the treatment, it means that he's developed antibodies in one scenario to the drug and then switch to a biosimilar. There is a concern that they will lose a response to the biosimilar as well. There's also always a concern for an allergic reaction if one has an allergic reaction to an originator, that they may develop the same reaction to a biosimilar just by virtue of their similarity in their molecular structure and biological properties. Lastly, there is always a concern for a confusion regarding naming and branding, and you can see an example here when it comes to Remicade. So Remicade, or another name for Remicade, is infliximab. Has been in Europe, it has a biosimilar to refer to as Remsima. And as you can see, Remsima and Remicade has very similar names, and the concern is that both prescriber and patient might confuse the two and may use them interchangeably when in fact they were not approved to be used interchangeably.
So the Government and Industry Affairs Committee of the CCFA worked to develop a position statement so that the CCFA could advise others of their stand on this issue and on how we hope biosimilars will be brought to market for our patients with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. The position statement is available in full on the CCFA website, and I'll refer you to that. But it includes the following. First, the committee and the CCFA feel strongly that these should be studied in humans, which may make complete sense to you, but it was important to say. Secondly, that switch studies to demonstrate interchangeability are absolutely necessary before patients can be switched from one agent to another. Thirdly, that the understanding of immunogenicity and cross-reactivity is a very important concept. One of the things that my colleagues may need to learn is that when a patient has anti-drug antibodies to an originator or to a biosimilar, those anti-drug antibodies are likely to cross-react with the originator or the biosimilar. And switching between biosimilar and originator when a patient has those will result in lack of response and other problems. And next, we discussed the need for a unique name and identifying information for each drug so that there won't be confusion. And we also discussed the importance of communication, notification to the prescribing provider if the drug will be switched, notification to patients, as well as the ability of prescribers to write that they want something dispensed as written or brand medically necessary, so that the prescriber can make a distinction of what they want for their patient.
We want to encourage all of you who join us tonight to become advocates. Although biosimilars are not anticipated to be available until 2018, it is important that you are informed and advocate for your care. You should understand your insurance and be knowledgeable about your state laws. Be proactive, discuss this with your gastroenterologist, and you're welcome to get engaged and become a CCFA advocate. As you can see at the bottom, there are some resources for you to learn a little bit more about biosimilars on your own. And here are also some references regarding biosimilars.
So that concludes the formal part of our presentation. I want to thank Dr. Cleveland for her terrific contributions, and also, as we mentioned, Laura Wingate and Kat Soto from CCFA for their ongoing efforts. We know there's going to be a lot more discussion about these agents as they become available and as our patients are starting to face these decisions with their physicians and with their other prescribers. We now have time for questions and answers, and fortunately there are many questions that you have all asked, and we've organized them so that we can start going through them together, and we're encouraging you to enter some more from your computers, and we'll do our very best to get to them tonight. I would just ask that you try not to make the questions too specific to you as an individual, but rather more generic so that we can try to address everyone's concerns here. So let me start with a question from one of you that said that a patient says that she's been tested and has antibodies against Remicade in the past, and she wants to know whether or not there's similar tests for Humira. So let me back up for a second just to tell the audience that any protein that's administered to your body can induce an immune response. That's how vaccines work. When you get a vaccine, you develop an immune response. That's how you become immune to it. And similarly, when we give you a protein-based therapy, whether it's Remicade or Humira or any of the monoclonal antibodies you heard about, your body can develop antibodies against it. And when you do, we know that there's a loss of response, and we know that you can have an injection or an infusion reaction. The answer to this particular person's question is there are tests for these antibodies for Humira, and there are tests available for these antibodies for Remicade. There are not yet available tests to look for these antibodies for the other biologics I mentioned this evening, but they are coming. And in addition to knowing whether or not you have anti-drug antibodies as a way to understand if you're losing response to one of the drugs, there's also a way to measure the drug level as a way to understand what's happening to the drug in your body. One of the important concepts of tonight, though, is that this particular example, antibodies to Remicade, tells us that this patient should not receive the biosimilar infliximab because it's expected that those antibodies will cross-react. Okay, the second question I'm going to ask Dr. Cleveland to answer, which is, are biosimilars usually less expensive than originators, and how might they be handled by insurance companies?
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. So biosimilars are, but the cost saving by using biosimilars is anticipated to be about 25 to 70% compared to their innovator product. That does not mean that it will necessarily be cheaper or felt by patients who may be paying for these drugs. However, they are anticipated to be cost effective, and that is thought to be secondary to their manufacturing process, and by the fact that we don't have to do all the lengthy steps and studies that you do with an originator.
Good. So the next question we're going to answer is, could biosimilars have different side effects from the original medication? It's a good question, and the answer is they're not supposed to. So if they have a different safety profile, or even if they work better than the existing drug, technically that's not a biosimilar anymore. So if the new version of the biologic that's designed to be a biosimilar somehow has a different safety profile or ends up having a more effective mechanism of action, it actually doesn't get approved as a biosimilar, and it'll require a different pathway through the FDA. I think that that's helpful. for you to know. It should be reassuring to you as well, but it doesn't get away from the question of what do you do after the biosimilar already has FDA approval. We have argued that industry should be following these patients on these drugs, and we should make sure that there's no new safety profile that appears. The European and Asian experiences that have been reported so far have been reassuring, and as expected, there has not been a difference in side effects or risks. All right, next question I'll ask Dr. Cleveland. If we were allergic to biologics, would we also be allergic to biosimilars? So how can the doctor make that decision, and how should the patient think about this?
So we discussed this a little bit earlier. Biologics and biosimilars should have a very similar molecular structure and biological properties, and therefore biologics, the originator, and a biosimilar are expected to have similar side effects, as Dr. Rubin just mentioned. This goes along the line of his last answer, that if a biosimilar has different safety profile, it is not likely to be approved to be a biosimilar. So in short, I would answer that yes, if a patient had an allergic reaction to an originator, the biosimilar of that originator is likely to provoke the same allergic reaction. However, I do want to emphasize that if a patient was on a biologic and then switched to a biosimilar of a different originator, that does not necessitate an allergic reaction. So it's important that you understand that a biosimilar of an originator might provoke the same response, but a biosimilar of a different originator may not.
So that leads to another question that I think is relevant to this evening, which is if you fail a biologic, what are the odds that you will fail a biosimilar? So I think what this individual was asking is, if you fail the originator, what are the odds that you'll fail the biosimilar? It's an important question, and it brings up, why do people not respond to the originator? So if the patient doesn't respond to the initial use of the originator, that's what we call primary non-response. And that can be due to the fact that the mechanism is just not working. It can also be due to other complicated features of how the drug is cleared from the body. If a patient has primary non-response to one biologic, switching to a biosimilar or even switching within the class of those biologics, meaning from one anti-TNF to another, is unlikely to provide much benefit. That doesn't mean that we don't still try it, but you have to really have your physician work with you to investigate whether the inflammation is active and why the patient may not be responding. The second part of this is, though, if somebody's responded to their original biological therapy and now they've lost response, there are a variety of reasons that can happen. One of them is because you've developed anti-drug antibodies, which we've covered a bit tonight. The other reason that can happen is if the disease has progressed through that mechanism. And this is where checking drug levels and looking for antibodies can be helpful, but also being thoughtful about what's going on in the patient. Somebody who's on infliximab and says that they're doing well, but every 6 weeks when they're waiting for their 8-week infusion, they have breakthrough symptoms, but then they respond again at the 8 weeks, is somebody who we can usually just adjust the dose of the infliximab and get them back under control. But somebody who says, I'm not having a response anymore at all and I used to do really well, or they've developed some allergic reaction to the drug, is very likely to have developed antibodies or something that we're not going to be able to overcome with just additional doses. And then we have to think about going to a different class of therapy, maybe to the anti-integrins, or even considering other treatments like those that are in development right now in our clinical trials. So let's move on to another question. I think that the next question that might be worth answering is, are there many risks of adverse reactions with Entyvio as there are with Remicade? So this is a bit more specific to the different drug classes. Reminder that Entyvio is an anti-integrin, Remicade is an anti-TNF. And in general, they haven't been compared head-to-head, but in general, systemic immunosuppression, which is what Remicade and steroids and azathioprine do, has had more side effects than Entyvio, which is focused primarily on the gut. And so I think that that's a reasonable thing to think about. All right, the next question will be for Dr. Cleveland, and we're going to ask about, I think we've gotten through almost all these questions. Okay, so let me refresh and see if there's a few more that we can add to it. So how about, is the delivery method of biosimilars similar to the originator drugs?
Yes, so part of the process of approving a biosimilar is looking at not only its molecular structure and its efficacy, but also its route of administration. So that is part of the requirement of a biosimilar. It should have the same dosage and the same route of administration as an originator.
Somebody asked here whether or not the biosimilar infliximab in Europe is interchangeable with Remicade. And the answer has been that it has been interchanged. It doesn't have a specific distinction like the FDA gives it, but they do have some studies now that have been shown where they're switching and where they're trying it in that way, sometimes because it had to be switched, sometimes because the prescriber elected to switch it. And so far, it seems to be safe in that scenario. Somebody wanted to know, do we expect that insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies will have programs to help patients who can't afford their medicines?
Yes, Dr. Urban, I presume they will be.
In fact, as we talk to all these companies developing these agents, we've emphasized the absolute importance to do that. As Dr. Cleveland said to you guys before, I think it's important to know that although it's going to save money on the insurance side when the drugs drop in price, we don't know and we're not sure at all that it's going to change your copays or how much you have to pay for your premiums, et cetera. So I think that remains to be seen, and we need to really advocate for these types of things for our patients. It's a very important question. I'm glad that was brought up. So there's a question here about, will biosimilars be approved for children? Dr. Cleveland, you mentioned a bit about extrapolation of the first biosimilar for infliximab.
Yes, so Inflectra actually has been extrapolated in ulcerative colitis in children. In Crohn's disease in children.
So we don't know yet about the other ones, but because the drugs are approved for kids, the FDA will look at the available evidence and make decisions on a case-by-case basis for each of these drugs. But it's expected that they will be used just like the originators are for children as well. Obviously, it's very important to know, and we obviously want to make sure that the safety is as expected in that situation. Okay, so let's ask another one. Doing my best to get through these here, guys. I'm very appreciative of all these really thoughtful questions. Somebody said, I'm still having trouble understanding the main advantage of biosimilars. Would it be cost or something else? I think that that's important. It will drive down cost. It will make available more therapies for our patients. But there aren't advantages in terms of it being a better treatment. But in general, when we have more options for patients, it definitely drives the field. I think that when we had 3 anti-TNFs approved for Crohn's and for UC, it made people more comfortable using the therapies in general. I think having more biosimilars available is going to result in more attention on these agents. I think it will lead to more people being able to get on them. I'm very much an advocate for trying to encourage insurance companies to allow us to use the drugs earlier in the treatment pathway for people who need them. I've been trying to push against the concept that people have to fail all their other therapies before they get to some of these drugs. And I think that once we have more companies that are investing in the IBD space, we can also push back to ask for more research, which I think will be helpful for all of us. And we've made it clear that if they want to be in the IBD space and try to develop therapies for our patients, they should also be willing to invest in additional research that will advance our understanding of how to take better care of you all. Okay, I think that we're about wrapped up here. Kat, are there any, I'm looking through the questions right now, but Kat, are there any others that you think we should try to hit tonight, or do you want to tell them a little more about what the CCFA offers?
It looks like there's one more question that just came in. Will there be any clinical trials in the future for any of the biosimilars, or will we rely on the European experience?
Oh, thanks. So, good question. I presume that this individual wanted to know whether there'll be clinical trials in IBD for the biosimilars, as opposed to just what's being reported from Europe and Asia right now. We've been asking for some work to be done in IBD, but we wanted to advance the field. We don't want them to just do Me Too studies. And we do think it's important that if the drug gains extrapolation into IBD, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing some studies to see whether we can learn more about how it works in our patients. So I think you can expect there will be some trials. I don't think that they'll be necessarily the regulatory FDA trials, but they might be sponsored by these new companies that are entering the field to learn other things that we're going to try to teach them about. There's a question here that I'm going to throw to you, Kat, which is, what can I do to become an advocate? And maybe that's a good introduction to your last part of the presentation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rubin and Dr. Cleveland. I first want to say your presentation has been very insightful, and your answers to our questions have been very thorough. So thank you very much. But before we get to your question, I want to remind everyone that a recording of today's webcast will be placed on CCFA's website within the next few weeks. You will receive an update once it is made available. And as you exit today's webcast program, you will be prompted to complete a brief program survey. And we ask that you please take a few minutes to provide your responses, as your feedback is extremely important to us when we plan for future educational activities. So thank you again. And the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America offers a comprehensive array of services for patients and caregivers touched by inflammatory bowel diseases. The Irwin M. and Suzanne R. Rosenthal Inflammatory Bowel Disease Resource Center, or IBD Help Center, is here to provide information, support, and guidance to help you manage your disease and take charge of your life. You can call or email our information specialists to ask questions and to obtain helpful resources to ask regarding your disease. They are available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time at the information shown below. You can also take part in local educational events, obtain disease-specific publications, and engage via virtual education, such as other webcasts, videos, and social media. You know that you are not alone. Connect with others for support by participating in CCFA's peer-to-peer programs, engaging through our online community discussion groups, and learning more about our Camp Oasis program for children. We also offer a variety of online resources to help patients and caregivers with disease management, including our I'll Be Determined website, our GI Buddy app, and teens and young adults can also connect and learn about their disease through our teen website and Campus Connection websites. To learn more about all of these resources and how CCFA can offer support, please call our IBD Help Center and visit our website at the information shown below. If you're looking for fun, family-friendly activities to raise mission-critical funds for CCFA, please sign up for our Team Challenge, half or full marathons, Take Steps walks, or Spin 4 programs near you. And before exiting, please remember to complete our program survey that should have been pushed out in a separate web page during the program. We want to thank again AbbVie Inc. and Amgen for their support of this program, and our speakers, Dr. Rubin and Dr. Cleveland, for their knowledge and expertise. On behalf of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, thank you for joining us. Goodbye. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, welcome and thank you all for attending tonight's webinar on biosimilars. My name is Catherine Soto, National Education Manager at CCFA. This program is supported through a sponsorship from AbbVie Inc. and an educational grant from Amgen. Additional support is provided through CCFA's annual giving programs and donors.